Okay, we will be talking about the cerebral hemispheres, including the general structures within. This is going to be our discussion points for this lecture session. I'd like to thank the dogs and cats outside for providing extra sound effects. So let's begin. Now, just to make sure especially when we're talking about a lot of visual stuff. You have to think in 3D, which means you have to visualize a lot of things. And in order for you to visualize a lot of things, you have to um, have that 3D image. And when we're talking about cutting the brain into sections, you have to know the planes involved. Okay, so for example, if you have three basic planes, you have your this one, your sagittal plane. So basically your sagittal plane, you're cutting the brain into your left and right hemispheres or parts. If you're talking about your coronal, okay, coronal or frontal section, you're basically cutting your brain into front and rear, okay, or anterior and posterior. And then if you're talking about the horizontal plane, you're basically cutting it like that, superior and inferior. Okay, so again, we're going back to your basic anatomic planes, your three anatomic planes, and that's how we should visualize these. So when I say we're gonna cut it in the sagittal plane view, in the coronal plane view, in the horizontal plane view, that's what we're going to talk about. That's how we're going to visualize it. Okay, so you have to get your bearings straight. And in order for you to do that, you have to know the basic anatomic directions, cardinal planes, etc. So in in your studies, in your career, you do not delete your old files in your memory because those are actually very important for you to understand more advanced concepts. So don't just think that once it's done, it's gone. No, you have to remember them. You have to incorporate them um, into new lessons. Okay, now let's start with your basic um, embryology, but don't worry about that. We're not going to be very strict, or we're not going to be very detailed on that. But your notochord, or well your embryo would first develop, and um, part of your embryonic cells will give rise to your um, nervous system. So basically, what I'm showing you on the right side would be the embryonic development of your brain. You can see that this part here started with that one. Now, you can basically divide your embryonic brain into your forebrain, your midbrain, and your hindbrain. Okay, so your forebrain is termed your prosencephalon. Your midbrain is your mesencephalon. Your hindbrain is called your rhombencephalon. Okay, so that's your forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Now, you don't have to worry about your midbrain because the midbrain leads or develops into, of course, that same name, midbrain. And that is one of the, or that is a very, very small part of your central nervous system. Now, your prosencephalon or your forebrain further subdivides into your two parts. Major part would be your telencephalon. Basically, that's your cerebrum. And your diencephalon. Okay? Your telencephalon is even further subdivided into your dorsal and your ventral. But don't worry about that because basically your let's take this. Your dorsal telencephalon will basically give rise to your cerebral hemispheres. And your dorsal, or sorry, ventral will be your basal ganglia, which are basically small islands of gray matter in the sea of white underneath your um, cerebral hemisphere. We'll tackle them in a short while. Well, not really in detail, but we'll just show you the rough location of the basal ganglia. And of course, your diencephalon is somewhere in the middle. Okay, also at the base of your cerebral hemisphere. Okay, now, so you have your forebrain, you have your midbrain. Now we're going to talk about your hindbrain. So your hindbrain is made up of your two parts, your metencephalon, and basically that gives rise to your pons and cerebellum. And you will have your myelencephalon, which will give rise to your medulla. Okay, so now you have the three major parts of the brain, and then you have your the major parts of the brain that give rise to your different subdivisions of your central nervous system. And so we've now shown you the basic parts. So basically, when you talk about the brain stem, part of your brain stem is your midbrain, pons, and medulla. Okay? So when you're talking about hindbrain, you're talking about pons, cerebellum, and medulla. Okay? But don't worry, people don't, in the course of our um, lectures or sessions or studies, we're mainly going to talk about brain stem. We're not going to talk about the hindbrain per se because it's a bit confusing because you have this quite important structure here that always sticks out like a sore thumb, your cerebellum. So it's better to just speak about the brainstem because you're now talking about the midbrain, pons, and medulla, and you're separating the cerebellum. Okay, so now let's go to the next part. Now, let's talk about your cerebrum and diencephalon. Now, in order for us to do that, we have to do a sagittal section. We're going to draw sagittal section of your cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so you have your left and your right cerebral hemispheres, and as we all know, your left side basically controls your right, and your right hemisphere basically controls your left side of the body. It's um, inverted. Now, of course, we've mentioned before that your cerebral hemisphere, okay, basically has this arrangement where the outer layer is gray and the inner layer is white. Now, in your gray matter, of course, when you say gray matter, you're talking about neural bodies, bodies of your neurons. And the outer layer of your cerebral hemisphere is called your cerebral cortex. So when you're talking about cortical functions, you're talking about the most superior, the highest level of thinking or function. Okay, that's the top level. That's the executive, that's the CEO of your brain. Now, let's talk about your white matter. Now, your white matter is basically the axons of your different neurons. Okay, because you have to remember, make this stick into your mind. When you're saying gray, it's you're talking about neuronal bodies. Okay, when you're talking about white matter, you're talking about axons. Okay, so your axons come from your neural bodies. Mainly, they're in your cerebral cortex. And you have two major white matter bundles there. One is your, we've mentioned this before, it's a fan-shaped collection of your axons. This is called your corona radiata. Okay, and this corona radiata will eventually get bundled up into a very thick bundle of white matter, and that is called your internal capsule. Now, there's another bundle of white matter coming from, let's change the color, from one side of the hemisphere going to the other side. Okay, so you have that bundle of axons coming from one side, one cerebral hemisphere, going to another cerebral hemisphere. Basically, it connects the two hemispheres, and that's what you call your corpus callosum. Okay, so basically your corpus callosum connects, let's write it down so you will not forget. Your corpus callosum connects your right cerebral hemisphere to your left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, whereas your corona radiata and your internal capsule, what does it do? It connects your brain to your lower parts, your brainstem, and spinal cord. That's what it connects. Okay, so is that clear? Now, once you have that, now we're going to talk about the diencephalon just to get it out of the way early. So when you're talking about the diencephalon, it is a midline structure. So let's draw a midline line there. and you have an oval nuclei there, okay, and that is basically your thalamus, okay, thalamus. Basically, it's a collection of nuclei. If you've seen the video on the thalamic nuclei, you would see that it's composed of 50 or more smaller nuclei, each with its own specific task. So it's so very complicated. Now, once you're talking about the diencephalon, all you have to think about is the thalamus. So all thalamic nuclei is part of your diencephalon. So what does that include? You would have your thalamic nuclei proper. You have your epithalamus. You have your hypothalamus. You have your subthalamus. Okay, so you have all those, and somewhere located around here. Okay, so that's your diencephalon, basically. Now, if you really want to be strict about classification, you also have to include the third ventricle. And basically, your third ventricle is just that part, a hollow part of the brain that has your CSF, and it's connected to your lateral ventricles here. Okay, anyway, so that's your diencephalon. Now let's go back to your cerebrum. Your cerebrum is not only that. Previously we've discussed other nuclei in the white matter inside the brain, and we've discussed your lenticular or lentiform nucleus, right? So you have an inner globus pallidus. So basically this one is your lentiform nuclei. Note that nuclei, okay, well, let me change that. Nuclei. And your lentiform nuclei is divided into your inner globus pallidus and your outer putamen. Okay, so these two are basically part or make up your lentiform nuclei. Not only that, you have another nuclei that looks like a tadpole. Let's choose another color. Let's choose this one. So you have another nuclei there that looks like a tadpole. The head is here, and then the back is somewhere here and there. Looks like that. So if you look at it on the sagittal view, if this is your corona radiata and this is your internal capsule, your lentiform nucleus is here. You have your globus pallidus and your putamen there. And so your caudate nucleus looks like this. It has a head here, and then the tail is at the back in the medial side of your internal capsule, corona radiata, and then the tail comes out somewhere here, there. So this is your caudate nuclei. Now we're going to, let me erase this one. So basically that's your other nuclei there. We still have to discuss the basal ganglia, but so if you would look at the orientation, your main, just remember this, your main landmark would be your corona radiata and your internal capsule. Medial to that, medial to that would be your thalamic nuclei and your head of your caudate nucleus. Lateral to that would be your lentiform nuclei and your tail of your caudate nucleus. Okay? You remember the name of the tip of the tail? That's your amygdala. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about one more structure which you might encounter later on, and that is your striatum. And your striatum is basically it's gray matter. Okay, it's gray matter, and it connects. It's this one. It's a gray matter that connects your globus pallidus. So we'll look at it in your coronal section. Your striatum is basically the connection between your the head of your caudate nucleus and your globus pallidus. So this is your striatum. It's called your striatum because if you look at your if you section it and you look at it and you put stains, it looks striated. That's why it's called the striatum. It's part of your basal ganglia. So your basal ganglia, now that we've talked about it, it's not a specific ganglia. It's a collection. It's like a group of companies, a group of nuclei. And your basal ganglia is all around the base of your what do you call this? Your cerebrum. So for example, you have your midbrain here. Okay, so your midbrain has your substantia nigra. It has you have your subthalamus at the base of your cerebrum. Okay, so your basal ganglia includes that. You have your substantia nigra. You have your striatum. You have your lentiform nuclei. You have your caudate nucleus. So you can see that most of the nuclei at the base of your brain, even your main thalamic nuclei, is part of your basal ganglia. And your basal ganglia is basically very important eventually in motion. And don't worry, we'll talk about it in time. We won't go into specifics right now because it's going to be very, very complicated. Okay, so now we've talked about a lot of stuff already, but most of it is just a review from last time. So, okay, here we have a picture of half of a brain. That's one cerebral hemisphere. So you can see that, let's draw, okay? Let's draw. Let's just add your midbrain here, okay? So let's draw your corona radiata, okay? Your internal capsule, okay? And it goes straight into your internal capsule, eventually goes straight to your midbrain, to your pons, to your medulla, and to your spinal cord. So basically, it all goes down there. And not only one way. You have axons going down, and you have axons going back up. Okay, you have descending fibers. So you have ascending fibers. Ascending fibers are called afferent. Basically, from the tip, from the receptors going back to the brain, that's sensory. And your descending is efferent, motor usually. Okay, so you have that, and then you also have fibers going from your cerebral cortex, and it's going to the other side, and that's your corpus callosum. Now let's look at your nuclei. You have a central nuclei here, medial to your internal capsule, therefore it is your thalamus. You have a space here filled with fluid, that's your lateral ventricle, and then you have a third ventricle here, a very narrow slit. You have a nuclei here that is on the lateral side of your internal capsule, and it has layers. So that's your lentiform nuclei, your globus pallidus and your putamen. And then you have your caudate nuclei there. Okay, so let's see on the other side. There we go. So you have your thalamic nuclei here. You have your third part of the third ventricle. Actually, your thalamic nuclei even has a connection between your left and right thalamic nuclei. See that? Your striatum is basically a connection between this, the head of your caudate nuclei and your globus pallidus. Okay? And you can see that the globus pallidus has two subcomponents. We're going to discuss that on the section on basal ganglia. It's an advanced topic, so don't worry about it for now. So, and then you have your subthalamic nucleus. Now, I'm going to ask you, what are the parts of your diencephalon? So, diencephalon, we're going to point it out. Try to follow or try to do it before I do. Okay, so the first part would be your main thalamic nuclei here. Part or your third ventricle there, just to be strict about it. Your subthalamic nucleus, your hypothalamus, which is not shown here, but we'll just draw it somewhere here. Your epithalamus and everything else. Everything thalamus is part of your diencephalon. Now, so let's talk about, how about your basal ganglia? Don't worry, it's supposed to what's the term? Interlock, or anyway, basal ganglia. What are the parts of your basal ganglia? Your lentiform nucleus, your caudate, your striatum, your red nucleus, your substantia nigra in your midbrain, your subthalamic nucleus, and your thalamus. Okay, so those are the basic things that we need to understand. On our next section, we'll be talking about the general or the gross anatomy of your cerebral hemispheres, exterior-wise. And just before we end, I just want to talk about this corpus callosum. It's very interesting because if you look at, well, even YouTube, if you open up YouTube and you just search for what happens when you cut the corpus callosum, you have a disjunction. The two hemispheres no longer talk to each other, and it's going to come out very interestingly. Interesting if you're not the one who had this cut. If you're just studying it, it's very interesting. If you're the one with a cut corpus callosum, it's going to be pretty messed up. Anyway, males and females actually have a difference. Their we men and you women are wired differently. Have you heard about no? Have you heard about what you call women's intuition? Turns out that as we are developing in the fetus, or as a fetus developing, males basically lose a lot of neurons. Males are basically brain damaged. You lose a lot of neurons. And they found out that the main difference is that women, I hope I'm getting the science right, but women have more interconnections, especially between the left and the right. Okay? Women notice things more. When women talk to other people, they notice the smaller things, the gestures of the hand, the twitch of an eye. Only very few men can actually notice that. The typical male doesn't notice that. So when two males talk, the guy would probably say, "Oh, I'm good friends with that guy," and then the female would say, "Really? I think he's being, I think he's a crook, or he has nothing good in mind, because I can sense that there's something wrong with how he's talking to you. You notice how he turns his head, he speaks words differently, you know." And the men would just say, "Well, he didn't punch me, so we're probably friends." So that's the difference. Women notice things more, and that is sometimes good and sometimes bad, which is a topic that is way out. But it's something interesting. The brain is a very interesting thing to study, and I hope your appetite is stimulated with this type of lecture topic, the brain. So I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening.